Captain Steeve's got his FAQ on 16 questions answered on the Air India 171 and the 2018 fuel switch locking bulletin board. We talked about this in depth yesterday, so let's take a look at some of his comments here. Could the fuel switches have already been in the cutoff position at takeoff, and the engines only shut down once the aircraft lifted up and the gear retracted? Highly unlikely. That is one of the most fuel-intense portions of flight, and it's unlikely you would have gotten airborne with those fuel switches off at takeoff. Not to mention you would have had so many errors before V1, your decision speed to continue the flight or not, that you would have aborted the takeoff. Mind you, I'm a jet pilot as well, and when we abort on takeoff, which we've done many times, obviously as precautionary practice for cases exactly like this, we pull the throttle, feet on brakes, reverse thrusters if you have them, and you're pulling off to diagnose your issue. Very, very common. Much better to abort before V1 if you had an issue like this. Highly unlikely, but let's see what Steve says.
We've been in the cutoff position at takeoff, and the engines only shut down once the aircraft lifted off and the gear retracted. No, that's not how they work. They're in a detent that holds them into place. The engines would cease running. You wouldn't be able to push the power up to take off. So no, that wouldn't have happened. Sorry. All right, S.R. Snur writes, I'm just an aviation enthusiast, not a pilot, but I'm curious about the mechanics of the fuel control switches. You mentioned they have...
No, they can't be left in the halfway position. I'm going to skip past this. They don't function that way. Just the way the little gate sits there. You know, there are actually a lot of people now, Boeing pilots, who are posting videos of these fuel switches on X. And it's nice for you to be able to see, because I use these all the time as well. The fuel switches that I have, though, as well as these detent position switches, they're slightly different in that the top of the knob is different, but the bottom is the same. So this is the example of the Phenom 300 cockpit. So this would be on the pilot and command's left, so the left seat, left armrest, essentially, or where your left arm would sort of hang out. As you can see here, we've got our BAT 1, BAT 2, generator 1, generator 2, bleed 1, bleed 2. These have the detents, which you can actually see really well here on the Phenom. And you can't leave a switch in the middle position because there's so little for the switch to rest on here. It would end up just falling to one of the sides, so that wouldn't work. This halfway positioning thing is really not going to happen. And when you use these switches, you recognize it. But here is an example of one of the videos that's circulating on X about how the Boeing switches look, which use the same detenting function. They show you the lift function. I see how they're showing how you can't push it down without lifting it. So in other words, you really have to lift to push down. All right, so let's get to the next Captain Steve FAQ here. So the next one he's got, if the fuel switch controls valves were placed in the cutoff position during the takeoff roll or shortly after, wouldn't the systems, like the airborne logic, generate a warning? I would expect yes. It seems like a critical situation. But again, what's the point? Like, what good does it do you? Like, you get a CAS message that says fuel switches off. And you're like, oh, why'd you turn the fuel switches off? I didn't. Okay, well, let's turn them back on. You know, that all happened in the span of about 8 to 10 seconds based on the preliminary report. So, yeah, it is likely that there was a warning, but let's listen to Steve's take.
Roll, or shortly after liftoff, wouldn't the aircraft's systems, especially the airborne logic, generate a warning either visually or orally? It seems like a critical situation that should trigger an alert. Is there no such warning built into the system? That's an excellent question. I've never done this. I'm going to assume that
most people don't turn the fuel switches off. Same. I would also just guess that there would be a fault that would say something like fuel feed flow, fault, or some form of crew alerting system message.
There is. It's probably going to say on your screen fuel cutoff. You're going to know that already because you can see that the fuel switches are in the wrong position, or you're going to see the other person reach over and...
Yeah, but you wouldn't necessarily have seen the other person reaching over for those. You also wouldn't have necessarily seen the fuel switches in the cutoff position because you generally don't look down there. In the course of a normal flight, I don't look down at my engine switches, which are actually, if I'm looking forward, the engine switches are not where the throttle is, but they're sort of behind it. So you really have to look down and over. It's very awkward. It's not something that you generally look at during the course of a flight. Where you would see it is your engine thrust, which is right in front of you, going, boo. It'd be very obvious.
Grab them at an inappropriate time. The biggest indication that they're not in the right position is right here, your ears. You're going to hear the engines immediately spool down, and that you're expecting that big roar to continue after takeoff. If you hear boo, and the
dude, he made the same sound I did. That's funny. Yeah, I mean that's right on, dude. All right, should video cameras be required in cockpits? I've seen this a lot. I mean, I basically video all of my flights anyway. I'll tell you, I'll tell you one of the reasons why aircraft unions are not going to want videos
and then just
in the cockpit, and it's because of stuff like this. So stuff where you're flying, and this is an example of a flight where I say, you know, Bitch and Betty is getting out of hand. This is a little bit of, we call I call her Cockpit Karen. The airlines call her Bitch and Betty. She's the lady that goes 500, you know, whatever. So listen to this clip right here. And this is a totally safe landing. Everything was fine about this landing. But I'm coming into this visually and I'm turning into this. And the aircraft is going to project where I'm going to be at a certain bank, assuming that I'm going to maintain a certain bank or pitch angle. Whereas I'm turning in, flying like a human, and I know I'm going to be lifting out of this roll position that I'm in. But the computer is projecting, hey, if you maintain this, you're going to hit the ground. So you're going to hear the warnings, pull up, sink rate. I would guess that the pilot lobbies are going to look at sort of normal things that happen that end up, you know, becoming now subject to either leaks or creating panic where they shouldn't or whatever. And it's also awkward because you've already got the cockpit voice recorders recording, but then the idea potentially of cameras. I think the pilot lobby will end up stopping that also because of the fear of FAA violations. Hey, we saw you weren't wearing your seatbelt or whatever. Now, the flip side then is, but would that be better? Would it save lives? I don't know, because a video recording doesn't necessarily stop an accident from happening, but it lets us see more context. If we had video footage in this case, we would have seen who did it. Was this a murder-suicide, or were the switches defective? So this is actually a perfect case where video would have been fantastic, because if the switches move themselves back through some turbulence or a mistake, then that 2018 FAA bulletin should be a mandatory airworthiness directive. But I do think there's also just too much resistance from the pilot community for things that, like, I like to share because, you know, I find these all training opportunities. But I also recognize that, you know, the FAA could be watching all of these videos and then they send you fines for stuff that you're sharing as an educational opportunity. That would be a risk factor. Take a quick listen to just these about 15 seconds here.
To come in here.
Sink rate. Pull up. Go around, wind shear ahead. Unstable approach. Sink rate.
Ahead. All of them. You're good. You're good.
500.
Speed's trending down. We're stable. Runway 22's all yours. Heber Valley traffic, 300, short final 22, Heber Valley. Little power maybe just so we don't sink. There you go. Nice. Very good. Boom. Runway's made. Power's out.
And there it is. All right. So that shows you a little bit of kind of what it can be like inside of a cockpit. And they could be, you know, intense situations sometimes because it's like, oh man, that's an exhausting landing or whatever. And, you know, maybe a lot of pilots don't want that kind of stuff out there. Again, I think it'd be more of a pilot lobby issue. So should they be required? Maybe. Is it going to happen? Probably not. We'll listen to a very quick POV of what Steve says about that.
Here with the camera in the cockpit is that somebody is going to leak it and they're going to use it.
Bingo. That's literally exactly what my thought was. Exactly. This is why the pilot lobby is never going to go for this. All right. Is there pressure to blame pilots over design flaws? That's a weird question. I don't think there's any pressure to blame pilots for design flaws. If there's a design flaw, why would you blame the pilot? I'm not even going to look into this. Are pilots required to do psychological evaluations? Well, you get classes of medical certificates, like first class, second class, third class. I have a first class medical certificate. And you sit down with an aviation rated doctor, basically, and they chit chat with you a little bit, like, hey, any thoughts of suicide? It's kind of like you're sitting down for an immigration interview, and it's like, are you a terrorist? Nope. All right, sounds good. Like, let's be real. You're not sitting down with a therapist, so no. FAA fuel switch locking bulletin explained. Okay, let's hear it.
Information bulletin, and there's the number on December 17th, 2018, regarding the potential disengagement of the fuel control switches locking feature. I think what that bulletin was about was the installation of the switch, because you could install the switch upside down, in which case it would just be impossible to put it in the run position. Since it's spring loaded, it would always.
That's not what it was about. I'm actually disappointed by that answer. The bulletin literally said, I'm going to pull it up really quick, but the bulletin literally says, right here, the potential of disengagement of the fuel control switch locking mechanism. In other words, not that it was maybe it was installed inappropriately, but Captain Steeeve is basically telling you, oh, if it was installed inappropriately, it just wouldn't work at all. But then you wouldn't be able to turn the damn plane on because you would never get fuel flow. The problem here was whether it was an installation issue or some form of defect in the actual product. The problem was that this SAB was issued based on reports from operators of the Model 737 airplanes that the fuel control switches were installed with the locking feature disengaged. Fine. The airworthiness directive concluded that this was not an unsafe condition. The fuel control switch at its design would include a locking feature on similar models, including the 787 Dreamliner, which is the subject of this investigation, where basically the fuel control switch could disengage right here regarding the potential disengagement. So the turning off of the device that would lock in place that switch. This is very different from, it's just not working at all after install. Obviously, then it's going to get issued. The whole point of that blocking mechanism is so that I don't turn off things that I need. Again, if I look at what's to my left when I'm flying, if I turn off my generators or I turn off my batteries and shut down all the electricity in my plane, these are massive problems. These are not switches that I touch during flight. There are obviously very rare emergency procedures where we might operate some of these. But generally, you don't touch this. And this photo, by the way, is of the aircraft on the ground because you can see the GPU in use button is on, which is only possible when you're on the ground on a Phenom. But anyway, I don't agree with Steve's explanation on this one.
Was default back to the cutoff position. And so I don't think that was a situation here on this Air India 787 because you would know it the very first time you tried to engage the fuel.
Yeah, exactly. But that's why I think your explanation is wrong. He's basically saying, that whole airworthiness bulletin was just because if it was installed wrong, it just wouldn't work at all. Exactly. You would know it on the first one. But I don't think that's what the bulletin says. I think the bulletin says that that block could just not be functional at all. So you could use the switch to turn it on and off, but it just wouldn't prevent you from turning it off without lifting it up. So it'd be an easier shutoff. So it could actually operate routinely for hundreds of flights. And it only becomes a problem when it's accidentally bumped into, such as when Blanco Lirio suggests, what if somebody, one of the co-pilots was guarding the fuel throttle and then during turbulence accidentally bumped those switches.
Control switches.
So I don't like that explanation at all. General Electric Microprocessor Bulletin.
Right. Next is Eric M9768. On July 11th, 2025, a reader made the Aviation Herald aware of a service bulletin released by General Electric and the FAA. The bulletin was, and here's the number, which recommended the replacement of the MN4 microprocessor on ECU with respect to the engine fuel and control staging. I don't know about this particular bulletin. Bulletins are.
By the way, this all goes into the theory that there could have been some form of electrical disaster at your electronic control units that essentially sent a signal to the FADEX to set them to a reversionary mode because of a potential weight on wheels sensor malfunction or whatever, bringing the thrust to idle even though the position was advanced forward, reducing thrust to 0, explaining why there was no flame out witnessed on these engines. Given that the preliminary report talks about these fuel control switches moving from run to cutoff, this seems unlikely to be an issue anymore. A student pilot and others have raised a critical point about mental health in aviation. They say the current system discourages pilots from seeking any kind of mental support for fear of losing their license, potentially for life. That's interesting. That's a really good point, because there's this idea of potentially like not wanting to seek help, because if you're seeking help, it means you have a problem. That's a good point. I think that's a fair question.
His Embraer Air Jets points out that on his aircraft, the engines won't shut down via the cutoff switches unless specific logic is met, like thrust levers at idle. He finds it alarming that a modern aircraft...
Somebody left me a comment on this as well. Basically what they're saying is, why are you able to turn the fuel switch off when the thrust is advanced? And the idea here being, shouldn't there be like a computer that says, hey, you have your thrust forward, I'm gonna assume you made a mistake because you're telling me you want thrust, but now you're cutting the fuel switch off. I'm gonna assume that you continue to want thrust because the lever is not at idle. They talk about how Embraers have this feature and the Boeings don't. That's definitely unfortunate in the Boeing case, because clearly, based on the preliminary report, these switches were moved to cutoff, and the thrust would have been in the toga position at this point, which is your takeoff and go around position, which is almost fully forward. Not 100% forward. We have a thrust reserve, that's maybe the last like 10% of the throttle lever that we reserve for emergencies usually. And they also add a cycle to the engines because they add a lot of wear and tear to them. All right, Mayday call a deliberate act. Let's listen to this one.
All right, Kate Bat 7538 says this: if this was a deliberate act, why would the pilot make a Mayday call? Psychologically, that seems like a very strange
Well, it could have been the other pilot, mind you. There are two.
thing to do. Furthermore, how do investigators know that the physical switches were in the cutoff position versus the flight data recorder simply recording?
I mean, here they're basically making this allegation or assumption that it's possible the actual data of the aircraft recording the actions of pilots, like, oh, switches at this time were moved to cutoff. They're assuming that that was written into the software wrong. But now we're really talking about a culmination of issues, because what we know is the fuel switches were set to cutoff at a very inappropriate time during flight, which made it impossible to relight in time, leading to the plane crash. If then you are also assuming that the data recording functions are flawed, boy, then, I mean, that just seems like it'd be like a 1 in a trillion chance, honestly. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but that seems a little wild. And again, you've got two pilots here, so, I don't know that because one of them called Mayday, it necessarily means it wasn't deliberate. It could very well have been deliberate. Could an electric bus have a failure cause the fuel cutoff? I mean, electricity is interesting. Usually you've got different circuits for all this kind of stuff, and everything is redundant on aircraft. But I'd be curious to hear Steve's take on this one.
Pabelote writes this: the fuel switches don't operate the valves directly. They instruct the aircraft's computer system, the ECAM, to do so. That is correct. All right. Is it possible that a major electrical bus failure could have told the computer to shut off the fuel valves? The answer to that is anything is possible. That's not what happened in this situation. The airplane was operating the way it was designed to operate. The Air India pilots went into the simulator, tried to simulate a total electrical failure and that would produce a dual engine failure. It simply wouldn't. That's not what happened here. They were placed physically.
That's fair. Okay, I agree. It's all about the fuel switches being placed off. Could this have been a cyber attack? Not really. The switches don't move in a cyber manner. Was cutting the fuel a last resort to prevent an explosion? No, because the fuel switches were found back in the on position before the impact, so that's nonsense. Was the rat deployed while the aircraft climbed? Well, remember the checklist on the 787, the 2 memory items of the 787, which I haven't seen Captain Steeeve bring up yet, but it's pretty simple because, and it's very different, mind you, from the 737 or a lot of other Boeing aircraft. But the 787-8 Dreamliner is very clear. In the event of a dual engine fail or like a thrust off, you move the fuel control switches to cut off, then run, and then you push and hold the ram air turbine switch to help these engines relight immediately. So, you know, the ram air turbine being deployed could very well have been a manual process, but it can also be automated. So I don't know that that matters. Could a dual engine fire be the cause? We saw no fire. There's literally video of the aircraft.
All right, Sassin Forever says, from my understanding, there is one conceivable scenario when we have a dual engine fire, when we cut off fuel to both engines before starting the fire extinguisher procedure. But as you said, this almost never happens during the first moments of the plane being airborne. That's correct, it doesn't. And the fuel handles, the fire handles were not pulled. All right, the flight data recorder, the preliminary report said the fuel control switches were placed from run to cut off 1 second apart from each other. So it wasn't the fuel handles being pulled. All right, Efidol off 610. But why didn't the second pilot do anything? Well, the second pilot did do something. So let's assume the one pilot cut the fuel to both engines. The other pilot looked at that pilot and said, what did you do, or why did you do that? There was a denial on that part. The other pilot then, within 10 seconds, grabs both fuel control switches and places them to run. That's an incredible presence of mind to think to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Whilst
That is fast. That is pretty impressive. It's like, wait, fuel's off. Wait, why'd you turn those switches off? And then turn them back on, bro. I mean, I guess it's also logical. So how impressive is it? I don't know. Maybe Captain Steeve's just trying to be nice to the pilot here.
still flying the airplane and trying to get some power out of those engines. So that's the sequence of events that happened in the cockpit. All right, well, that's it for this episode of Ask the Captain.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, some of those, I don't know how much that really adds in terms of color here. What adds some color is there is a Boeing pilot who did respond to my comment on the potential for a forearm getting close to these switches. He argues that arms are too high. I don't know if this is a height thing or a seat positioning thing, but shout out to that pilot who mentioned that their arms are usually not close to it, which is great, very important, because we're trying to understand, like, you know, could turbulence have led to some kind of bombing into this this position to where all of a sudden they're bumped into? You know, we're all looking for a reason to understand why did this happen and how could it be prevented in the future. So it's scary to see this this kind of stuff happen, and so that's why everybody's looking for answers here. Yeah, all right, so let's see here. Some people in the comments write, this is the possibility of gaslighting from the pilot asking the question or the one denying it. Let's see here. Even the best psychologist and psychiatrist in the world cannot predict everyone's behavior. This is in reference to people getting, you know, psychotic analysis as part of their medical screening. Interesting. Somebody's responding to Captain Steeeve here that the captain, you know, I guess Captain Steeeve argues that the cockpit voice recorder does the same thing that a camera would do in the cockpit. I disagree with that. And I think they actually bring up a good point in the comment here. In the comment, they say, why won't you replace all your home security cameras with an audio recording then? I mean, this is a good point. In fairness, like, I get why videos in the cockpit probably won't happen, but I also see how they could be extremely useful, because it would just remove all doubt over what happened. We could see, did somebody accidentally bump it? Did the person guarding the switches bump it? Did somebody's, you know, for whatever reason, arm fall it? Did something fall on it that accidentally, you know, remove these switches off? Or did they just wobble their way down, which just seems crazy that they would both wobble their way down? Or did somebody slip their hand over and go, time for me to check out? Click, click. I hope we get some more color because I'm not sure that the answers that we're getting so far are as thorough as we'd like them to be.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.